Hi. President Biden's pardons on an ethical level were a mess, in my opinion. Once you get into pardoning relatives, it's a complete disaster for the country on a moral level. I think what Trump did with pardons made a lot more sense when it came to a constructive use of the pardon power. No, it wasn't perfect, but I think it was a much more reasonable use of that power than what Biden did on pardons. Let's face it, it's a controversial constitutional area when you get into presidential pardons. I think it will basically always be about half the country will agree with it, with an outgoing president, and maybe about half of the country will hate what that president did when it comes to pardons. A lot of it is because of the issue with the rich and powerful. I sometimes believe this power needs legal reform. I think if the crime isn't political or government related, that there should be a different way to go about this. I think that those pardons probably should be decided by federal courts or the U.S. Supreme Court. It needs a lot of reform. I also think that basically crimes that are political or highly controversial that are related to the government could be decided by the president. But I think basic type crimes that are totally outside of those areas could be decided when it comes to pardons in a newly created court system that would handle these kinds of issues. I think it could be handled within the federal court system or possibly outside of it, where we would have a newly created court system to handle certain kinds of presidential pardons. You would have to reform the Constitution to be able to do that, and that is complicated. For example, the president could go to this newly created court system on the federal level and apply for a pardon for these kinds of cases with the court. He could testify on behalf of the so-called defendant, and then that group of impaneled judges at the federal level would decide whether that person actually gets a pardon. You could put 5 or 7 people on that court. It would have to be an odd number, obviously, because of the event of a possible tie. He could testify, and they would make the decision whether that person should actually be pardoned. I think that would make a lot of sense in most of these cases that are about basic crimes at the state or the local level that have nothing to do with the functioning of the government, politics, or the presidency, or what have you, according to our Constitution. I have a fear that this type of power is going to be heavily abused in the coming decades. Presidential pardons are now being used for a lot of the wrong reasons. They now represent a stain on the presidency, is what's starting to happen, depending on which situations you look at. I have a fear that this power is going in the wrong direction and that we need to change it. I think it's largely being abused by the office of the presidency because of financial influence and power influence in Congress and in our own government. Just look at presidential pardons in the last roughly 30 years. It's a mess. It needs to be reformed somewhere. It's up to the people and their representatives to go about looking into this. It's a messy issue now, and it needs massive reform, in my opinion. Once again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your consideration. It's free to subscribe.